The roar of a Harley once promised freedom. Now it signals betrayal. Thousands of riders are reporting catastrophic failures. Oil systems choking, shock mounts snapping, and brake lines routed like a ticking time bomb. Dealers told them, "You're the only one." But the truth? It stretches across years, across models, across generations. If you think this won't touch you, think again. Values are crashing, insurers are circling, and regulators are digging for answers Harley doesn't want to give. Missing this story could mean losing thousands on your bike, or trusting a machine that might fail when you least expect it. This isn't just about motorcycles. It's about the collapse of an American legend. Stay to the very end, because this proves that it was never an accident. Outrage ignites. This wasn't a blip, it was a breach. For decades, Harley Davidson riders built their lives around machines that were supposed to be unshakable. The rumble of a V-twin was more than sound, it was a promise. But when the first reports of failures began trickling into rider forums, that promise cracked. Owners described stalls, sudden losses of power, and parts wearing down before their time. What started as isolated gripes snowballed into threads, thousands of comments long. The betrayal hit hardest because it cut across generations. Grandfathers who had sworn by Harleys for half a century now watched their sons and daughters deal with defects they never expected. In garages and on group rides, the anger grew. It was not just about metal and oil, it was about pride. Riders who had spent tens of thousands of dollars felt like guinea pigs instead of customers. Some bikers compared notes and discovered their problems matched exactly, suggesting a larger pattern. Others shared videos of breakdowns on open highways, the kind of failures that could end more than just a ride. Dealers tried to reassure, but the words fell flat. For a community that prided itself on loyalty, being told, "You're the only one," sounded like gaslighting. The sense of solidarity turned from celebration to resistance. And once that switch flipped, no amount of chrome polish could hide the truth. The anger was raw, but it was only the beginning. Because underneath the frustration lay a mechanical flaw that turned oil from lifeblood into poison. Oil system betrayal. When the oil turned against the engine, the damage was immediate and undeniable. The Milwaukee 8, Harley's flagship power plant rolled out in 2017, was supposed to represent progress. Cooler running, smoother shifting, and more torque for touring riders. Instead, it brought with it a haunting word that echoed across repair shops: sumping. In plain terms, sumping meant the oil refused to circulate as designed. Instead of flowing back to the tank, it pooled inside the crankcase. At low speeds, riders barely noticed. But at highway pace, when lubrication mattered most, the engine starved. Bearings overheated, metal surfaces scored, and in some cases, the entire power unit seized. It was a failure not of neglect, but of engineering. Owners who had serviced their bikes religiously, following the manual to the letter, found themselves facing catastrophic repairs after only a few thousand miles. Videos showed oil mist shooting from breathers, dipsticks reading far below normal, and angry riders holding receipts for repairs they thought should never have been needed. The sense of betrayal deepened when whispers circulated that Harley engineers had flagged oil pump weaknesses early, yet bikes kept rolling off the line. The forums lit up with accusations that this was less about accident and more about indifference. And once word spread, the question became louder. If the engine's very heart could not be trusted, what else was waiting to fail? As it turned out, the answer was lurking right at the handlebars, where a bend in a line could decide between life and death. If you've seen these patterns too, or if your Harley's been in the shop longer than the road, hit subscribe right now. Drop a comment with your story, because the more riders speak out, the harder this truth is to bury. Brakes that bent the truth. A bend you can't see is a crash you can't avoid. Riders depend on brakes more than any other safety system, especially on heavy V-twins that weigh well over 700 pounds. So when reports surfaced that a poorly routed front brake line could rub against the fuel tank, alarm bells rang across the community. What looked like a simple design oversight carried terrifying consequences. Fluid could leak, Pressure could vanish, and a rider leaning into a curve could suddenly discover the lever had gone limp. Stories emerged of close calls. One rider in the Rockies described cresting a hill, pulling for brake pressure, and feeling nothing but slack. He was lucky enough to downshift and roll to a stop, but his voice cracked as he recounted what might have happened with traffic close behind. Others found worn spots on lines during routine checks, proof that metal and rubber had been grinding together silently for months. Harley eventually issued a recall affecting thousands of bikes, promising free inspections and replacements. But by then, the damage to trust was done. Riders asked why such a glaring hazard had slipped past quality checks. They wondered what would have happened if one more rider had been less vigilant or less lucky. The brake line defect showed that Harley's problems were not confined to engines. And if the front of the bike could fail, the rear was about to prove it could too, this time on a scale no one could ignore. If you've been burned, start by protecting yourself. My reliable, road-tested gear and accessories are linked in the description. 82,000 VINs, 82,000 motorcycles don't lie. That was the staggering number attached to the recall of Harley's Softail line after investigators found a weakness in the rear shock adjuster tab. The flaw was deceptively small, a mounting tab that could bend or break. But the consequences were massive. If the adjuster shifted out of position, it could rub against the tire, leading to sudden deflation at speed. In the world of two wheels, a blowout is not an inconvenience. It is a potential death sentence. Riders who had trusted their bikes for cross-country runs now feared the very components meant to keep them stable. Service centers reported a flood of calls, each owner clutching a VIN that might place them inside the danger zone. For Harley, the scale of the recall was devastating. This was not a handful of bikes or a rare production error. This was a systemic design flaw touching nearly every corner of the showroom. The numbers made denial impossible. Tens of thousands of machines meant tens of thousands of lives at risk, and the community knew it. Anger turned into demands for accountability. Owners began asking not only for repairs, but for answers. Who had signed off on the part? How long had the company known? Why had buyers not been warned sooner? The shock adjuster recall cemented what riders already feared. Harley's problems were not isolated glitches, but evidence of deeper cracks in quality control. And once the evidence stacked this high, the next battle moved from garages and highways into boardrooms and offices. The timeline wars, the dates don't match the damage. That was the refrain echoing through rider forums once the official recall notices finally went public. Harley Davidson's chronology painted a picture of discovery and decisive action. The company said the first signs of defects were logged only recently, that engineers investigated thoroughly, and that the recall was launched at the earliest responsible moment. But owners had the receipts, digital ones scattered across years of posts. Screenshots from 2018, 2019, and beyond showed complaints about sudden oil starvation, brake line wear, and suspension quirks. Riders could quote the mileage at which their bikes failed. They could list the service departments that turned them away. What Harley described as isolated, owners saw as systemic. The disconnect was more than just dates on a timeline. It was about trust. Riders felt the company had minimized early warnings to avoid the financial hit of a recall. Every skipped service bulletin looked like an intentional delay, and every delay suggested profit mattered more than safety. The longer this narrative hardened, the harder it became for Harley to claw back credibility. The official story was one thing. The lived experience of riders was another. And when those worlds collided, the fallout traveled straight into the wallets of people who thought they had bought a piece of American legend. Because once the dates stopped lining up, the dollars started vanishing. Value down the drain. A sticker can cost you thousands. That was the painful reality confronting Harley Davidson owners who walked into dealerships only to learn their machines carried recall histories. A simple service label in the logbook or a line on a Carfax report was enough to slash value. Buyers negotiating trade-ins treated those bikes like liabilities. What had once been a $20,000 investment now struggled to fetch 17 or 18. Some riders told stories of dealers knocking off even more, citing buyer hesitation and market stigma. Resale values do not collapse in a vacuum. They collapse when trust evaporates. Riders who once planned to trade up to the next big twin found themselves underwater on loans, staring at equity gaps they could not close. Others who had treated their Harleys as long-term keepers suddenly felt shackled, owning machines that could not hold value in a marketplace flooded with negative headlines. The financial damage multiplied when insurers began raising eyebrows. Some carriers quietly adjusted premiums, noting higher risk tied to certain VIN ranges. That hidden cost only deepened the sense of betrayal. Owners had paid premium prices for premium bikes. Now they were paying again, this time for flaws they did not cause. Losing money hurts, but losing faith hurts more. And when the market punished owners, the riders themselves decided to turn their frustration into something sharper: evidence. Because once the dollars slipped away, the determination to prove a pattern only grew stronger. Riders turn investigators. From bar stools to spreadsheets, the movement grew. It started casually, riders comparing VIN numbers at rallies, scribbling notes on napkins, swapping war stories over beer. But casual chatter hardened into coordination. Owners began creating online spreadsheets cataloging every failed oil pump, every worn brake line, every bent shock tab. They posted service invoices, photographs of parts, and mileage logs. The crowdsourced archive became a weapon, proof that failures were not random but widespread. What began in frustration became strategy. Forums organized into working groups, assigning volunteers to contact affected owners, compile defect clusters, and map production years against failure modes. Amateur sleuths cross-referenced recall lists with warranty claims. Some even traced part revisions back to factory suppliers, arguing that Harley must have known long before official action. Each spreadsheet cell represented more than numbers. It represented trust eroded and money lost. The grassroots effort caught attention outside the community. Journalists picked up on the organized data, lawmakers' staffers scrolled through forums, and regulators began noticing the same phrases appearing in multiple posts. Oil sumping, brake line interference, shock tab failure. The language of mechanics was turning into the language of accountability. By now, Harley faced not just angry individuals, but an informed, mobilized base of riders who could present evidence like investigators. And once owners became investigators, regulators could not stay blind. Because the moment spreadsheets turned into dossiers, the eyes of Washington turned too. When Washington starts reading owner posts, the stakes change overnight. Regulators do not ride Harleys down Main Street, but their staffers monitor forums and news feeds. Once the noise grew too loud, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration stepped in. They launched defect investigations, demanded engineering reports, and pressed for full recall documentation. Suddenly, the chatter of riders became the basis for official scrutiny. The inquiries focused on critical questions. When did Harley first know about sumping? When were the brake line defects detected in internal audits? How many warranty claims flagged the shock adjuster tab? Regulators wanted answers on timelines, risk assessments, and corrective actions. The threat of congressional hearings loomed in the background. Politicians, eager to champion consumer safety, signaled they were prepared to drag executives into public testimony if cooperation lagged. For Harley, the pressure was immense. A recall costs money, but a congressional investigation costs reputation. The company now faced not just lawsuits and angry customers, but the possibility of fines, mandated redesigns, and years of federal oversight. The culture of independence that Harley riders loved so much was suddenly being policed from Capitol Hill. Regulators had entered the ring, and the balance of power shifted. The community that once felt ignored had Washington as an amplifier. And once lawmakers smelled weakness, the battle spread beyond the paper trail into the marketplace itself. Because after regulators, the next opponents would not be politicians. They would be competitors circling for blood. Dealer gridlock. Service bays turned into parking lots. That was the sight across Harley Davidson dealerships from California to Carolina as the recall storm hit. Riders lined up for fixes, only to be told parts were scarce and wait times stretched into weeks, even months. Mechanics, already stretched thin, faced impossible schedules. Shops that once prided themselves on weekend tune-ups and chrome installs became holding pens for disabled motorcycles. Owners grew restless. A touring bike parked during peak riding season was more than an inconvenience. It was wasted money and lost freedom. Some dealerships quietly advised customers to keep riding despite symptoms, gambling that nothing catastrophic would happen before replacement parts arrived. Others offered vague promises of loaners, though few had enough inventory to honor them. Frustration spilled into online reviews, and once loyal customers described service departments as indifferent, even hostile. The crisis exposed a weakness Harley could not disguise. The dealer network was supposed to be the company's front line of trust, yet it buckled under pressure. Instead of reassurance, riders got silence, delays, and mounting bills. Each day a bike sat idle was another reminder that the brand had failed them. Dealer gridlock might have been survivable if Harley stood alone. But the motorcycle market is a battleground, and rivals were watching with sharpened blades. Rivals seized the moment. Your pain is their ad copy. As Harley wrestled with angry customers and clogged service bays, competitors pounced. Indian Motorcycle rolled out glossy campaigns celebrating durability, reminding riders that reliability should never be optional. Triumph highlighted engineering consistency, pointing to decades of steady refinements. Even Japanese manufacturers like Yamaha and Honda subtly hinted in advertisements that their touring models did not strand riders on highways. Fleet buyers paid attention too. Police departments and rental agencies, long reliant on Harley's touring bikes, began shifting contracts. Agencies in southern states tested fleets of alternative cruisers, citing concerns over maintenance downtime and liability risk. Each lost contract represented not only revenue, but also visibility, as patrol bikes and rentals served as rolling billboards for the brand. Rivals understood that Harley's pain was cultural, not just mechanical. They did not have to name the scandal outright. Every whisper about durability cut Harley deeper. Riders already questioning their loyalty now had alternatives staring them in the face. For the first time in decades, Harley risked losing not just sales, but the aura of inevitability that made it the default choice. Competition was fierce, but the most dangerous blows were not in ad copy. They were in the hearts of riders, where culture lived and loyalty once seemed unshakable. Cracks in the culture. When a brand patch starts to itch, the community feels it. Harley Davidson was never just a manufacturer. It was a cultural emblem stitched into jackets, tattooed on arms, and flown as flags at rallies. For generations, loyalty was less about specs and more about belonging. To own a Harley was to join a brotherhood. But when bikes began failing, that bond frayed. At rallies from Sturgis to Daytona, riders whispered doubts. Stories of oil sumping and shock failures replaced the usual tales of open-road glory. Clubs debated whether to keep endorsing Harleys for official rides. Some younger members, unwilling to inherit what they saw as problems from their elders, explored other brands. What had once been pride now felt like exposure. Riding a Harley no longer guaranteed respect. It sometimes invited questions. The betrayal hit hardest among old-timers who remembered when Harleys were icons of durability. Watching their brand falter in front of newcomers felt like a personal slight. Culture thrives on myth, but myths cannot survive endless recalls. The roar of an engine once symbolized freedom. Now it sometimes symbolized fragility. The cultural wound was deep, but it was not unprecedented. History offered a chilling reminder that Harley had stumbled before, and the echoes of that stumble now grew louder. Deja vu in the cam chains. We've seen this movie, Tensioners, again. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, Harley faced another scandal when the twin-cam engines suffered premature failure of cam chain tensioners. Riders spent thousands on repairs, lawsuits flew, and the company's reputation took a hit. At the time, Harley promised lessons had been learned. New designs, new testing protocols, and new assurances were rolled out. Yet here we are again. The V2 defects resurrected memories of the twin-cam disaster, stirring a sense of déjà vu among veterans of that earlier crisis. Forums filled with side-by-side comparisons of then and now. The parallels were impossible to ignore. Mechanical warnings brushed aside, recalls delayed, and customers carrying the financial and emotional weight. The repetition suggested not an accident, but a pattern of neglect. What made the comparison sting was Harley's own rhetoric. After the twin-cam mess, executives spoke about renewed commitment to quality. Owners were told history would not repeat itself. And yet, as V2 engines failed and shock tabs bent, riders felt trapped in a loop, living the same betrayal under a different name. Deja vu in the cam chains did more than remind people of the past. It proved that the present crisis was not a one-off. It was part of a legacy. And that legacy, once dragged into the open, threatened to move beyond riders and rivals into investors and institutions. Investors lose faith. If you can't promise start and stop, Wall Street won't start you up. Investors once treated Harley Davidson stock as a stable bet, tied not only to motorcycles, but to an entire lifestyle brand. That faith cracked as the recall wave deepened. Analysts warned that warranty reserves could balloon into hundreds of millions, draining cash that was meant for research, dividends, and buybacks. Each recall meant more service labor, more replacement parts, and more goodwill repairs, all of which gnawed at quarterly earnings. Downgrades followed. Brokerages lowered ratings from buy to hold, and in some cases, to sell. Stock prices slipped as shareholders saw the scandal not as a bump, but as a fracture in management credibility. Leadership faced direct pressure. At annual meetings, investors demanded answers. When did executives first know? Why was production not paused? How could a brand that built its empire on reliability ignore red flags? Markets respond not only to losses, but to narratives. And the narrative forming was bleak. Harley looked less like a proud guardian of tradition and more like a company gambling on denial. The financial hit was real, but the reputational drag was worse. Investors began asking if the brand could recover at all, or if this was the moment its aura cracked for good. And as the boardroom grew tense, the factory floor was about to make noise of its own. Labor pushback. A union doesn't just bargain wages, it bargains pride. Harley's workforce, long celebrated for skilled craftsmanship, found itself in the crosshairs of the scandal. On the assembly lines, whispers spread that workers had raised concerns about oil pumps, brake routing, and suspension tolerances before the bikes ever left the factory. Some said quality checks were rushed, others pointed to production quotas that left no room for rework. For employees who took pride in building machines that carried the Harley name, the recalls felt like a personal insult. Union leaders seized the moment. They argued that safety and quality should be central to negotiations, not just pay and benefits. Calls emerged for stop work clauses that would allow employees to halt production if serious defects surfaced. Workers demanded more oversight and quality control, insisting that pride in the badge should never be compromised by executive timetables. Tensions flared in town halls where Harley employees and riders met face to face. Some workers apologized directly, explaining the pressure they were under. Others vowed to fight for the right to slow production rather than let bad bikes roll out the door. The labor movement made clear that this was not only about defects, it was about dignity. This story isn't finished. The next chapters will hit harder, and you don't want to be the last to know. Subscribe right now so you're first to see every revelation before Harley, dealers, or anyone else tries to spin it. But while workers pushed inside the factory, riders on the outside were organizing a movement of their own, one built not on contracts but on demands. Owners demand justice. What riders want is simple: fix it, prove it, price it in. Owners burned by the V2 scandal began to unite around common demands. They wanted guaranteed loaner bikes while their motorcycles sat in service bays. They wanted transparent redesigns rather than stopgap patches. They wanted assurances that resale values would not collapse, perhaps through buyback programs or extended warranties. And above all, they wanted honesty, not silence. If this hit home, smash that like button, share it with riders who need to know, and drop your experience below. And don't forget, subscribe right now, because the next chapter is already unfolding, and if you miss it, you'll be the last to hear what Harley never wanted revealed.